So AP Human Geography, here we are for our video about the 11.3. How does a manufacturer decide where to locate his or her factory? Based on the site factors. Remember, site factors are those factors that are present in that particular location. They are locational variables. Go ahead and have those guided notes out, / those notes we took in class, so that you can follow along with me. So remember, we talk about site factors when we refer to situation being near the raw materials or being the market the most important. In today's world, transportation is a far less important cost. This is because, again, remember, Weber created that model in 1909 when there would have been a lot less transportation options and would have been a lot more expensive. Today, transportation is much more efficient, much cheaper, and much more advanced, so it sort of negates a lot of that issue with the transportation costs. And so in today's world, industrial areas outside of Anglo-America, the United States and Canada, and Europe have become much more important, like Asia, and this is because the importance of that labor cost. So the savings in labor is so significant today. Remember, we talked about this hypothetical example of a company can locate their shoe manufacturing in the United States, and on average they have to pay their workers $20 an hour. Instead, they can locate that same factory in an LDC or sometimes even a DC, and they can pay those people $1 a day or $1 a week. Think about the difference in that savings for all their labor. It's so significant. When we talk about the goal of maximizing profit by minimizing costs, this is how you minimize those costs. Labor being the most important, and that is such a significant difference in the cost that it really it creates this comparative advantage. We're going to talk about an international division of labor, the comparative advantage for LDCs and DCs. That's what's led to that international division of labor. That's what's led to that outsourcing. So when you look at a country like Japan, Japan is, this is how we know situation and what situational factors and transportation costs are far less important today, because Japan is very far from the markets of the United States and Canada and from Europe. And they really don't have many raw materials, but they're still a major industrial power, and that is because of their site factors, mainly their labor. So when we talk about site factors, we know that the cost of business varies from location to location, and then even within, so from country to country, those costs are different, and then even within a country, from region to region. We're really talking about 3 different production factors or site factors: land, labor, and capital. Let's start here with land. So historically, and we'll learn about this in the next unit, we talked about that factories could be multi-story, and then after some labor disputes and new labor laws, factories had to be 1 story. So you can't build up, you have to build out, so you need a lot more land. And a lot more land was available and more cheap in the suburbs and the rural areas. So again, we'll learn in the next unit that most manufacturing used to be right near the city center, but the most expensive land in any city is right there in the center. So when they needed more land to build better and newer factories and 1-story factories, they had to relocate these outside of these cities and into the rural and suburban areas. Again, we talked about in 11.1 that prior to the Industrial Revolution, industry was really dispersed. So each community, each sort of township area would have its own blacksmith, maybe its own mill, maybe its own textile processor and such. That's because of that limited transportation, so it was more dispersed. But after the Industrial Revolution, industry became more clustered where the raw materials are, mainly near coal, because things became coal powered. So coal fire powered. That's why these cities like Manchester and London, you'll read about that they were so historically so dirty, is because of that coal burning, that soot coming out of those factories. And so electricity became an important source of energy for industry in the 20th century. Some industries that required high levels of electricity, like aluminum, had to locate where there was very cheap electricity. Aluminum, you saw a lot of it locating where there was hydroelectric power, so water power from dams. A lot of the aluminum industry in the United States was in Buffalo, New York, near Niagara Falls. Next, let's talk about labor. So labor costs are different from country to country, and again, even within the regions of countries. When we talk about labor intensive, we're talking about an industry that labor is the majority of the cost. And labor is really divided into skilled and unskilled labor. Skilled meaning that it requires more training and more schooling, so it tends to be higher wage. Low skilled meaning that it doesn't require much training and it doesn't require much schooling, so it tends to be low wage. And we'll learn about in the next key issue that this division between high skilled and low skilled tends to create this international division of labor where you have high skilled, high wage in MDCs and low skilled, low wage located in DCs and LDCs. Leads to outsourcing or sourcing outside of the country those manufacturing processes. And when we talk about unskilled, low wage jobs, the industry that's probably one of the most labor intensive and most dependent on low skilled, low labor would be textile and clothing. And you see like the spinning, weaving, and sewing, it may be divided up. The production processes may be divided up into multiple different countries. The spinning might be in one country, the weaving might be in another, and the sewing might be in another. You can see here's cotton yarn production located in countries that are high cotton production. Then you can see that the woven is mainly in India and China. So there's like the yarn in the United States from the United States is literally sent to India and China to be woven into that cotton fabric. And then shirt production. This is from 2006 or 2005, this map. In today's world, if this was present, you'd probably see a lot more of this shirt production down here in Southeast Asia as well. Over here in India too. And again, we talked about this would be the example of the multi-story building, and they were very susceptible to fire and ventilation problems and labor issues and bad work conditions. So new labor laws are what led to the elimination of the multi-story factory and the beginning of the one-story factory. Again, you see a lot of sock production in the southern part of the United States. This is because labor is cheaper in the southern part of the United States, and also we have so much cotton production. Knitwear, here you see the production. So about skilled labor, some companies must rely on skilled labor. For example, if you build engines that go into SpaceX rockets, you can't locate where there's cheap, unskilled labor. That's a dangerous scenario. So some companies, whatever they're manufacturing, because it's so advanced, it requires a high skill labor force. One would be computer manufacturing as well. And you see a lot of computer manufacturing located in areas of the United States where we have our best universities, so like California and Michigan and the Northeast. Historically, when we talk about manufacturing in the United States, you had this Fordist approach where you had mass assembly and the assembly line, and people had one job and they did that job all day, every day. Let's say screwing the bolt on the rim of a tire, they just did that all day. The post-Fordist movement, this was that they would train their workers to do a variety of tasks. This created a more efficient workforce and also a more flexible work environment. So again, here's our electronic, you see, and these are in areas where you have the best universities. Next, let's talk about capital. Capital is money for investment. So manufacturers, they have to borrow typically to expand or to build new factories. And this is most difficult for institutions, for manufacturers and LDCs and DCs, because many of the financial institutions in these areas don't have the funds to loan out. So they have to get loans from companies in MDCs or banks in MDCs. This further perpetuates this corporate model. And oftentimes, whenever they're talking about where to locate this industry, local and national governments will try to entice these industries to locate in their communities with incentives like lower taxes or free electricity or free water or free land or low-cost loans, because that location of that manufacturing or that facility there brings jobs, and those jobs then help an economy to grow. Next, let's talk about how does a company decide where to locate their factories. It's a combination of the site and the situation factors. So the site factors, the land, labor, capital, situation, they tend to locate near a break of bulk point, seaports, airports, rail ports, and it'll be a combination of the trucking, the rail, the sea, and the shipping in order to negate those transportation costs. Next, let's talk about the influence of trade agreements. So trade agreements, this also will influence how to locate the factory. Trade agreements are what open up different countries and allow for that location of that production facility in different countries to take advantage of cheaper resources or cheaper labor. Example would be the North America Free Trade Agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And that's what allowed for so much, that allowed for the free trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and allowed for a lot of Canadian and United States manufacturers to locate their manufacturing, their factory in Mexico to take advantage of that cheap labor. These are called maquiladoras, the foreign-owned factory. They're owned by United States and Canadian companies, and they locate in Mexico within 35 miles of the United States border, but in Mexico. And if you look at the map between the U.S. and Mexico, you'll see clusters of these zones where these maquiladoras, these free trade zones, where the maquiladoras, the factories are all located, and you'll see them clustered there. And they're clustered there because that's where the rail and the transportation highway systems were already in place, because the whole point is they have to be able to move those raw materials into their factories and then transport that finished product back out for consumption in the United States and Canada. So again, you'll see them clustered along the border between the United States and Canada, but clustered where we already have rail and you have that highway system in place. So why did they set it up in Mexico? Well, multiple reasons. One, they want to move it to Mexico. Like, let's say it's Whirlpool and they're making washing machines. They would close up their factory in places like Ohio or Pennsylvania or Delaware or Michigan, and they would open up in these free trade zones. They would open the maquiladora, their foreign-owned factory, in this trade zone in Mexico. And that's because that labor is so much cheaper, so it maximizes their profit because they can minimize those costs. Also, they have lower environmental laws, so the way they dispose of their waste isn't as expensive. You have that transportation already in place with the rail systems and the highway systems to be able to move that raw material in and that finished product back out. It's very close to the United States consumer. That's why they located in Mexico and not those factories in sub-Saharan Africa. And Mexico's government's very stable. Their economy is very stable, so there's no risk of overthrow or civil war or an economic collapse. So those companies can build those factories and invest there and move their production, knowing that there's really no risk of it failing because of the government or the economy. It helps the companies maximize their profit, helps Mexico develop economically because they have these jobs in the production there. But it does take away jobs, manufacturing jobs from the United States, because we don't have those jobs, those factories in the U.S. anymore, and shifts us more to that tertiary-based economy. Again, what we're talking about, we talked about more in 11.4 with the international trade approach, leading to this international division of labor, this outsourcing. And then finally, let's talk about the special economic zones in China. These are also free trade zones. They were established by the Chinese government. The Chinese government is communist, so they do use the self-sufficiency approach to development. Remember, self-sufficiency is a way of development that is all through internal, so no external influence. That development is driven from within. But the Chinese government want to take advantage of some elements of the international trade approach, so they set up these special economic zones in China that were located along the Pacific coast, and this is where foreign investment could go in, and they could partner with Chinese companies who would have majority ownership, and they would be able to have advantage of that labor there, and then also be able to import some of their products there. So you can have Apple products and other foreign products in China, but there are rules in place that govern that. Some examples historically are Shanghai and Shenzhen, but you see these free trade zones in China have located in other places. So again, this is how we determine where we're going to locate. We talk about our land, labor, and capital. And capital tends to lead to what we call agglomeration. This is the